Well, joining me now to look at what to expect from the new cabinet are three observers from the different parties. Greg McEachern is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers is a longtime Conservative, and Farouk Karim is with the NDP. Gentlemen, thanks for coming in.
How come you were ageist towards me? Long time. He's as long time as I am.
Long in the tooth and long time supporters. Well, as opposed
I look up to you, Tim.
As opposed to turncoats. Listen, I want to first of all, interesting developments today with the Prime Minister meeting with the Mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, as well as with the Mayor of Vancouver. But what we had again was a reference from Jim Carr to the fact that the Prime Minister might be open to entertaining changes to Bill C-69 and maybe even Bill C-48. So the Environmental Assessment Bill and the tanker ban. Greg, what do you make of it?
I think what's really key is that they're not talking about reopening the bill. They're not going to reintroduce legislation. And from what I hear, they really want to emphasize that part, but they are open to questions around how it's going to be implemented. I think regardless of the outcome of the election, there was conversations in the spring, in the late spring, that they needed to do this. There were enough questions there. I think having a minority result makes the imperative pretty clear to them that they need to do this. And I think what you're seeing with the meetings from the Mayor of Calgary, Jim Carr's appointment. Again, this is all signals that need to be sent to the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But there was a result. The people in those provinces chose to vote a certain way. People in Quebec chose to vote a certain way. People in Ontario, people in Atlantic Canada. So Prime Minister Trudeau has to be mindful that he is not forgetting where his support came from. And I think we saw that very clearly in some of the choices in the cabinet around the strength of Quebec.
Okay, so some discussion about possible tweaking of Bill C-69 and maybe C-48. How far is that going to go in terms of what we're talking about in terms of anger in the West, Tim? Or for the opposition parties?
Well, it depends what the tweaks are, Martin, right? As Greg pointed out, and I think rightly, often it's in the implementation. And particularly when you're overseeing resource development, there's lots of regulations and guidelines. It's now those regulations. So the laws have been made, but how are they actually going to be regulated? That sounds good, but what is going to happen? And it's not just Conservatives who've asked for changes or been frustrated with. The new Natural Resource Minister gave a speech about Bill C-69 before he was Natural Resources Minister during the campaign in Newfoundland. That went over like a lead balloon. There's some pressure on the inside, but the other dynamic, as Greg alluded to, is so what does somebody like Stephen Guilbeault do? If there were to be significant changes. And again, we don't know degree of change, it's all just semantics at this point. So Trudeau does have to find a balance there. Can he find it is the question I would like to ask.
Okay, Farouk, the question too is when you have Jim Carr, who's now not in the cabinet, but he's a special envoy, if you will, to the West, who, when not dealing with his health issues, and we wish him all the best, is to be bringing the message back to the centre. And you also have Chrystia Freeland, who's now going to be the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. How do they deal with that if there are not going to be major changes to the basic environmental position of the government?
Well, that's the $10,000 question, because the government since the election, I think, largely accepted the narrative that there's a problem in the West, right? We have to deal with it. I mean, it is true. There is anxiety and frustration. So, I mean, to Trudeau's credit, unlike, we don't all live in Trump world where personal and electoral interests are primary. I think he's thinking also of the national interest, so to his credit. But this is a danger and a challenge. It's a high wire act. How do you satisfy without alienating your base that got you there, right? And Mr. Trudeau, within a minority situation, we're going to have an election 2, 3 years, whatever it is, 18 months. He needs to take care of his coalition, progressive coalition, Mr. Trudeau. And so if he goes too far into changing, apparently it's not changing bills, but the implementation of 69 and 48, if he goes too far, he might lose part of this progressive coalition internally, and other people who voted for the NDP, for the Bloc, or for the Greens.
But I mean, Greg, to the Liberal here, does this put an incredible pressure on Chrystia Freeland, like some sort of Wonder Woman who's going to somehow solve what is being really pumped up to be an alienation, a Western alienation, and a national unity divide?
I don't know Minister Freeland, personally extremely well, but I think she actually really likes a challenge. I think she really likes when people tell her that CETA is not going to be taken care of, or we're not going to be able to negotiate a NAFTA succession deal. I think she actually has that. She is has the right personality, the right mindset for that role. I'd love for you to tell her that she can't do it, because I think it just makes her all the more determined that she's going to do it. I also think that she likes the fact that she's kind of carving out some new territory. You know, her job description, it's been, I think, since the Martin era, since we had a deputy prime minister, and the fact that she is retaining control of the U.S.-Canada file speaks to probably her value to the Prime Minister, but also her ability as a negotiator, not just with other countries, but perhaps with the Prime Minister, saying, yes, I'll do this, but these are the things I want as well.
I want to, before we leave the Cabinet, I just want to ask one question, because it is interesting, and as political observers and political strategists, you can weigh in on this, and that is, we're talking about Chrystia Freeland, we're talking about Jim Carter, not in the Cabinet technically, but were there any surprises to you?
Well, the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity, that was the hokiest name I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot, we've all heard a lot of hokey names in there. I mean, I guess from a sectoral perspective, because I work in there, seeing sport being rolled up into heritage was sort of interesting. I think that'll cause a little bit of heat for the Liberals. The evolution, the quick evolution of Mendicino and Miller for being strong team players was something to see. I mean, they're both qualified. That's not to say they're not qualified. And I do like excuse me, the appointment of O'Regan to Natural Resources. I mean, he's a friend of mine, he's a friend of Greg's. I think a Newfoundlander, despite the question he received yesterday, or the Prime Minister did, to suggest that Newfoundlander wouldn't be able to empathize with Alberta. We're all in the same boat, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, depending on oil production, and Seamus certainly has a history there, if anything, the deck's stacked against him.
With a lot of Atlantic Canadians providing labor
in Alberta,
in the West.
But also, as when we were in Newfoundland, also a lot of those two members for St. John's also heavily involved in the regulation of the offshore.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, Greg, a pointed question. A lot of people were surprised to see Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor basically dumped as health minister. Any insights into what happened there?
So, if you know, my answer to the question that Tim received, surprise, Petitpas-Taylor and Kirsty Duncan. Now the thing is, you know, we kind of traffic in rumor and intelligence, you know, in Ottawa.
Intelligence firm.
Intel. And there wasn't a lot.
Or improper.
You know, yes, exactly. There wasn't. I've not heard any stories that there was dissatisfaction with either one of those roles. It may be that there's just a certain number of roles in cabinet, and that's the way it is. It is a bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah. Farouk, any questions? Any surprises?
Just to link it back to your first question on C69 and Stephen Guilbeault not having an environment portfolio of some sort, it's raising questions in Quebec, environmental groups, progressives in Quebec. He's coming from a riding that's highly progressive in the heart of Montreal. He got elected namely because people thought he was going to play a leadership role on climate change. So that's something to look for on the Quebec side. But it also links it to the Western alienation, because even McKenna not being environment minister anymore and Guilbeault not being part is maybe they're also victim of that too, sending a signal to Western that we want to change a bit the face of that file.
Okay, you raised something which I'm going to throw out there, and that is the decision to remove Catherine McKenna from environment. She made it clear in interviews this morning and yesterday and response in scrums that she didn't request that. So the Prime Minister decided on that. What do you make of that? Was that the trolls winning? Because we know that she was coming into a lot of opposition.
You know, so I think the way that she's been treated has been horrible. That being said, I have said on this panel, on this platform, and elsewhere, that I don't think she was often the most effective communicator on the environmental file. There's times where the Prime Minister stepped in with her to help push the message across. And as we talked about with Jody Wilson-Raybould, you are not a cabinet minister for life. You serve at the pleasure. And sometimes a change, just getting some new blood in there, is a very good thing for a cabinet.
Okay.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of, although the tenure wasn't as long, when Rona Ambrose was first minister, she was put in to be the environment minister, and her job was to convince people, or not convince them, just tell them that Stephen Harper was killing Kyoto. and that was her job. Catherine McKenna's job, in large measure, was to push an agenda that climate change was key and important. And I think both in Rana's case and in Catherine's case, there comes a time when you need to change and shift tone so a new messenger can help. And I think Jonathan Wilkinson is a new messenger with a slightly different approach.
Spoken like a strategist. Okay, I have to talk about what's happening tomorrow. Doug Ford is coming to town, the Ontario Premier, after an entire election campaign in which the Prime Minister, rarely did he spend a day where he wasn't mentioning Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario. And yet Mr. Ford is saying that that's all behind us. It's a time, interesting quotes from him today. What should we be watching for? Farouk.
I think Mr. Ford is seeing Mr. Kenney, Mr. Moe flexing muscles. He said, I'm going to do that too. I'm going to create a task force, minister task force. I noticed there's no environment minister in that task force, by the way. But so he wants to go and fight and see Trudeau and get money and transfers and economic development. So he's just trying to be in the game. He was largely absent for a few weeks during the campaign, so he's back, I guess.
Well, and sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I think Trudeau, you would have expected to treat Doug Ford badly. I don't think Conservatives expected Andrew Scheer to treat Doug Ford badly, which he did. They ignored him, they hit him away. So what does he owe Andrew Scheer now? Not much. What does he need? He needs to get reelected, and he has a bunch of infrastructure projects that he needs to get done in cooperation with the federal government. Look at the example of Frank McKenna working with Brian Mulroney. A lot of success for New Brunswick, even though they were on different sides.
And if you look at
weren't they on that one side of St. FX?
But if you look at the council that he's just announced today, as Farouk alludes to the membership of it, it's all the files where there's going to be a need for cooperation. Pharmacare, the health minister, intergovernmental affairs minister, infrastructure minister.
2 points on that, building off what's been said already. It doesn't hurt now Doug Ford to wedge off of Andrew Scheer. Andrew Scheer was very negative and critical of the cabinet, as you would expect an opposition leader to be yesterday. But Ford runs a government. He needs money from Ottawa. Greg's right on that point. Ford has also changed his tone in the last 6 to 8 months. This fits with the new tone. And there is a bit of jockeying among the Conservative premiers as to who speaks for the provinces. So I'm sure that's a bit of a calculation that Doug Ford has in there too.
Is it enough of a change of tone to have him reconsider his position on the carbon tax? Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick did. It doesn't sound like Doug Ford is going to.
There is some chatter happening. I mean, Alberta's adopted a carbon pricing strategy. New Brunswick is figuring out what has brought in carbon pricing. They're just waiting to get it approved. Palliser's promising a flat tax. Who knows what can happen?
Okay.
There is just quickly. There's an analogy to be made between Ford and Scheer and what's happening in Quebec between Blanchet and Premier Legault. Blanchet came out swinging yesterday, but like an opposition leader. But Legault, as a premier, said, "Oh, we can work with Trudeau. We're hoping to. The next meeting's going to come up soon, and they have, common
Okay, so we're out of time. But what we're saying then is that Chrystia Freeland's job may not be as difficult as we think.
Perhaps.
Well, time will tell. Good way to end. Listen, thank you very much for coming, and thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.